Hey, happy Tuesday morning to you, everyone. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. I just appreciate you being with me so very, very much. We are looking at the resurrection of 1 Corinthians 15. Paul said the resurrection would be at, quote, the end, unquote. Well, commentators assure us that the end there is the end of time, the end of the millennium, the end of the current Christian age. It's just the end of everything. But you see, the point of fact is, the Bible absolutely nowhere teaches or predicts the end of time. It emphatically teaches, explicitly teaches, that the rule, the reign, the throne of Jesus Christ is without end. It has no end. And by the way, this is a whole lot different than the Old Testament statements, that the sacrifices of the Old Testament cultists would be forever. That's the Hebrew word olam, which means until a designated time, until God's favor ceased. This totally different situation. When the Hebrews, or the Greeks for that matter, wanted to express endlessness, they said no end. Or they would compare things that were to pass away with the things that were not. So when we're talking about Christ's rule, Christ's reign, Christ's rule on His throne being without end, Luke 1:32-35, for instance, then we have a totally different ballgame. We're talking about an emphatic declaration by the God of heaven that the kingdom rule of Jesus has no end. And let me say this again, folks. This is so simple, yet so profound. If the Christian age has no end, then all futurist views of the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15 are simply false. What in the world did Paul have in mind in 1 Corinthians 15 when he said, then comes the end? Well, he very, very clearly, and commentator after commentary agrees with this, Paul has in mind, and he utilizes the imagery of the harvest. After all, Christ is the first fruits. After Christ would be those who are His at His coming. Then comes the end. This is the imagery of the eschatological harvest. To fail to see the imagery of harvest in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is to miss Paul's point. Christ is the first fruit. Afterward, those who are Christ at His coming. Harvest. Now, in Matthew chapter 3, it's really, really important. Jesus spoke about the wrath that was about to come. Matthew 3, verse 7. Who hath warned you, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, to flee from the wrath that is about to come? And he spoke of Jesus, whose shoe latches he was not worthy to unloose. And he said, catch this, his winnowing fork is already in his hand. The axe is already at the root. Now, two things here. Very, very important. The winnowing fork was an image, catch this, of the end of harvest, not the beginning. The winnowing fork is what was used after the wheat, after the tares had all been gathered together in a great big pile, and you took this fork-like thing and you tossed all that stuff up in the air and you let the wind do the separation. The image of Jesus having the winnowing fork in his hand was an indication that the end time harvest had arrived. This is absolutely inescapable. Notice what he says. He will gather the wheat into his barn. He will burn up the chaff with unquenchable fire. The axe is already at the root. Every tree which does not bring forth good fruit, folks, that's harvest imagery, shall be cut down and cast into the fire. Now, here is John who said, repent, for the kingdom of heaven has drawn near, Matthew 3 verse 2. He warned them about the wrath that was about to come. And he said, Christ's winnowing fork, the imagery of the end of the harvest, the axe is already at the root, a harvest imagery. We have John expressing the imminence of harvest over and over again. Now, was Paul talking about a different harvest in 1 Corinthians 15, of which Christ was the first fruit, anticipating the end? Is that a different harvest from that which John said had drawn near, was about to come? That Christ already had the winnowing fork in his hand? The axe was already at the root. And by the way, John was Elijah, who was to come at the time of the harvest and proclaim the great and terrible day of the Lord. Malachi 3 through 4. More on that later. All right? For now, what we have to see, here is John proclaiming the imminence of the end, the imminence of judgment, the imminence of harvest. He shall gather the wheat into his barn, shall burn up the chaff with unquenchable fire. The axe is already at the root. Every tree that does not bring forth fruit will be cast into the fire, cut down and cast into the fire. Folks, this is imminence. Once again, Jesus was the first fruit of the harvest. Are we supposed to ignore these correlations? Are we supposed to ignore these perfect parallels? The fact that Jesus was the first fruit demands that the harvest had begun. So are we supposed to believe that the harvest had begun with Jesus but has not taken place 2,000 years later, and Jesus was the first fruit of the resurrection at the end of the Old Covenant age, but the harvest will occur at the end of another age? Makes no sense whatsoever.